They will demonstrate his passion for reverence, his power of resurrection, and his perception of reality. Taken collectively, they will reinforce the undeniable truth of his divinity. And now our text today is found in John chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. Beginning at verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a place of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. You see, Passover was and is one of the 3 major holidays in the Jewish faith. It commemorates the time during Israel's captivity in Egypt, when the angel of death was sent by the Lord to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians. But that angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites, sparing them. Passover, along with Shavuot and Sukkot, are often referred to as pilgrimage festivals, meaning that if you were an Israelite and were living in Judah, you were required by the Torah to make the journey to the temple in Jerusalem. So Jesus and his disciples, and most likely his family as well, they head up to Jerusalem. Well, as we talked about in our last letter, as we talked about in our last lesson, up and down are not used in the same way that we would use them today. Instead of meaning north and south, up and down are used here literally. Thus, on the trip from Capernaum, located on the shore of Galilee, which is about 700 feet below sea level, from that point going up to Jerusalem, which is on a mountain plateau that's about a little over 2,500 feet above sea level, the travelers are literally going up. So once they arrived in Jerusalem, Jesus and the disciples would observe both the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that immediately followed. Now, the feast is often mistaken for Passover, but Passover only lasted for 24 hours, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread commenced that next evening, and that lasted for a week. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread commemorates the occasion when God instructed the Israelites to leave Egypt immediately. I mean, right now, and don't even take the time to allow your bread to rise. Well, upon arriving in Jerusalem, Jesus would have walked into a pretty chaotic scene. The city streets would have been packed with Jewish pilgrims from all around the area. Some estimates place that number at 300,000 to 400,000 people. In verse 14, we can read what confronted Jesus when he made his way up to the Temple Mount. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons. and the money changers sitting there. Well, it's not hard to imagine the dismay that Jesus would have felt when he observed the booths and the tables set up in the courtyard of the temple. I mean, how would any of us feel if one evening we come home and discover that someone had set up a flea market in the front yard of our house? What had originally been intended as a helpful service to the travelers who would have found it impractical to bring their own sacrificial animals with them, and that helpful service had been turned into an unsavory and a very lucrative business. The animals were sold at grossly inflated prices, and because of the profit that was there to be made, a lot of merchants would get into the livestock business just for that week, to the point where the outer court of the temple was literally a zoo. On top of that, many of the men would choose this time to pay the annual temple tax, and a cottage industry had been built up around that. You see, because of the high percentage of silver, only Jewish or Tyrian coins were accepted as a tax payment. If a foreigner wished to pay his tax, he would have to exchange his coins for the approved silver coins. The money changers were more than happy to do this, of course, for a fee that, well, according to F.F. Bruce, it could range as high as 12.5%. Now, we can't be sure whether it was the close proximity of the businesses to the temple or the exploitation of the devout, probably a combination of both. But we do know that Jesus is moved to righteous anger. What should have been a place of reverence and prayer had been transformed. It had been transformed into an appalling display of greed and disrespect. Instead of hearing the murmur of prayers and the sounds of joyous praise, Jesus was instead greeted by a scene that I imagine probably sounded like a combination of the New York Stock Exchange and a county fair. The purity of temple worship was a matter of honor. It was a matter of honor to God. And Jesus takes swift and decisive action to put an end to the mockery that he's witnessing. Verse 15 tells us that he makes a whip out of cords. Now, this was probably the ropes used to tie and lead the animals. Well, he makes a whip and he proceeds to clear out the area. He drives out the animal merchants and their livestock, and he overturns the tables of the money changers and pours out their coins, and he delivers a special message to the pigeon sellers. In verse 16, he instructs them to get out and take their birds with them, adding that they shouldn't be making his Father's house a house of trade. Now, it should be noted that although it was